Have you ever wondered how the final moment of your life might come for Saka? It wasn't the sharp stroke of an enemy's blade, nor the clean strike of an arrow through the heart. Her final moment arrived in silence through the desperate eyes of her own brother as he was forced to leave her behind in a barren ravine. That look weighed heavier than bullets cut deeper than wounds, for it confirmed the truth she could never deny: she had been abandoned by the person she loved most. Just 3 days earlier, Saka had still been a proud Apache warrior. She could ride as well as any man, thrust a spear as swift as lightning, and disappear into shadows like a hawk vanishing into the sky. Her people looked at her with respect. In her eyes they saw the fire of their ancestors, in her stance the pride of a nation. But war does not care about strength or honor, and a single cannon blast ended it all. The earth shook, smoke erupted, and in that instant her legs were gone. Flesh ripped apart, bone shattered, blood pouring into the dirt. The scream caught in her throat as she collapsed, but the true agony came later when her brother knelt at her side, his face pale, his hands trembling, his eyes wet with grief. He knew what he had to do, and so did she. No words were spoken. Only the hiss of a red-hot blade cutting down in desperation. One strike to stop the bleeding, one strike that severed not only her body, but her future. There was no time. The soldiers were closing in from the west. Gunfire rolled across the hills, hooves pounding against stone. The tribe had to retreat. They could not carry someone without legs. Saka watched their backs fade into the dust, her brother's figure swallowed by the haze. The only things left behind were a small skin of water and a few straps of rawhide. She had been left as if she were nothing but unwanted baggage lying there in the vast hollow of the desert, half alive, half dead. And then came the silence. The Arizona sun is never merciful. It hung above like a burning verdict, branding the skin with fire. Each passing hour blistered her body, seared her throat, drained her will. She raised the water skin to her lips, sip by sip, but the more she drank, the thirstier she became. By nightfall, the cold wind sliced through her wounds, carrying ants and scorpions that crawled across her bleeding flesh. For the first time, she realized she was no longer a warrior, but nothing more than spoiled meat for the desert's vermin. On the second day, fever took her. Her body shook, her breath came shallow. In delirium, she dreamed of herself whole again, riding through the forest, the voices of her comrades ringing like drums. But when she woke, there was only the gray sky above and the stink of dried blood clinging to her bandages. Beneath the scorched cloth, her stumps throbbed and oozed the smell of infection rising. No more spear, no more horse, no more war cry of her people. Only a half-body dragging weak hands through the dust, eyes staring up at an endless sky. She had once believed she would die in battle, falling with a weapon in her grip, honored as a warrior. But the truth was far crueler. She would die in silence, without drums, without prayers, without remembrance. By the third night, the stars burned overhead while Saka no longer had the strength to brush away the ants crawling across her stomach. She lay motionless, eyes wide, lips cracked open. In the darkness, she whispered her brother's name, Tana, not as blame, but as a fragile call-proof that she still existed. Yet the desert wind swallowed the sound. A woman once mighty in battle, now reduced to a broken body, left behind among stone and red dust. With every second, death moved closer. And perhaps the cruelest part was not the loss of her legs, but the knowledge that she had been abandoned completely, absolutely, in utter solitude. When someone is left to die, the last thing they hope for is usually nothing more than a fragile miracle. For Saka, that miracle came in the form of a stranger named Wade Holt. That morning, the sun hung overhead like a molten hammer, pressing its weight down into the ravine. Wade, a tall, lean man of 36, his dark hair already streaked with gray, rode his worn gelding brisk in search of a few strays from his herd. He was not a man given to words. He lived apart from the town of Copper Ridge, carrying the heavy silence of a past that had never let him go. Once he had fought for the South in the war, then tried mining cattle, driving even bounty work. None of it stuck. At last, he had taken a small patch of land in Arizona and built a cabin where no one came calling. Folks said he'd gone half mad after his wife died in a fire 3 years earlier. The truth was simpler. Wade had not lost his mind. He had lost faith in people. Brisk stopped short at the edge of a narrow slope. His ears twitched, his breath coming heavy. Wade narrowed his eyes, hand brushing against the revolver at his side, and stepped down. The heat shimmered, bending the air dust rising around him. Then he heard a sound that wasn't wind or animal. Faint rasping, almost human. He followed it slow, cautious. And then he froze, and lying there in the dirt was a woman, her body broken, the stumps of her legs bound in filthy cloth, the earth around her stained black with old blood. Her dress was torn to rags. Skin blistered by the sun, lips cracked, her eyes half shut, as though life itself was slipping away. Apache. At first glance she looked already gone, but then her chest rose barely stubbornly, as though she refused to let go. Every instinct told Wade to walk away. A wounded Apache on his land was a death sentence if anyone found out. Soldiers, bounty hunters, neighbors, none would forgive it. But he couldn't tear his eyes from her face. She wasn't pleading. She wasn't begging. Her eyes, fading though they were, met his with a steadiness that felt like judgment, as if she were silently asking him, would he turn his back, or would he save her? Wade exhaled through his teeth, pulled off his hat, and muttered a curse under his breath. He knew exactly what it meant if he carried her. Trouble. But trouble or not, he bent down, slid one arm beneath her shoulders and the other beneath what remained of her legs, and lifted her up from the dust. Her body flinched at his touch, a hoarse groan escaping her throat, but her eyes never looked away. He carried her back to his cabin, a one-room shack of pine and iron patches with a barn that leaned tiredly in the wind. He laid her on his cot, the only bed in the house, and went to work. From the barrel he fetched water. He boiled cloth on the stove, tore strips from an old sheet, and cleaned the wounds with pine sap and steady hands. The smell of blood and infection burned his nose. His hands were calloused, clumsy even, but careful. She never cried out, never begged him to stop. She only clenched her jaw, sweat running down her temples while the fire in her eyes flickered like a dying ember, refusing to go dark. All through the night, Wade stayed by her side. He pressed cool cloth to her forehead, poured drops of water against her lips when she couldn't lift her head, kept the lamp burning, though his eyes sagged with exhaustion. His shadow leaned long across the wall, a silent figure watching, waiting, guarding. For the first time in years, his heart beat with something more than emptiness. He wasn't staring at the grave of his wife anymore. He was holding on to the fragile breath of a stranger. By dawn, Saka stirred. The cabin roof loomed above her, strange and unfamiliar. The smell of smoke and pine filled her nose. She reached for what was left of her legs, felt only the rough wrap of cloth. The loss was still there, but so was life. She was not dead. Across the room, Wade sat hunched at the table, his pale blue eyes fixed on her. When her gaze found his, she rasped a single word, her voice little more than cracked air. "Silent man." He didn't answer, just gave a slow nod and stepped outside, leaving a tin bowl of thin broth at her side. For Saka, that was salvation. Not the food, not even the bandages, but the fact that someone had chosen not to leave her. He had stopped, lifted her, and brought her back. In that small wooden cabin, life had been pulled back from the edge. And in the harsh land of Arizona, 2 lonely souls had just crossed paths. One woman left for dead, and one man who had thought his life ended long ago. In those first days, after being saved, Saka lived somewhere between shadow and light. Each morning, when the sun slipped through the cracks of the wooden cabin, she opened her eyes and still could not believe she was breathing. The pain in her missing legs never left her, but alongside it came something new, the quiet presence of Wade. He did not speak much. Most mornings he simply set down a wooden bowl of thin broth or a cup of warm water and stepped back outside to his chores. Sometimes when their eyes met, He only gave a single nod. Yet it was that silence that comforted her. He did not look at her with pity. He did not see a cripple. He saw her as a person, someone worth keeping alive. Whenever Wade knelt beside her cot to change the bandages, Saka studied every movement. His hands were rough, but patient. There was no rush in the way he cleaned and wrapped her wounds. She realized then that this man, too, carried scars that no cloth could bind. She saw it in the pale gray of his eyes, in the limp that dragged his step each time he stood. Neither of them was whole anymore, but maybe that was exactly why they recognized each other. On the 5th day, Wade carried in a strange wooden frame. He had fixed 2 old cartwheels to the bottom, padded the seat with cloth, and placed it beside her bed. "So you can move yourself," he muttered, his voice low and rough, but not unkind. Saka laid her hand on it, tracing the coarse edges. Something stirred in her chest. Not pity, but a spark. For the first time since being abandoned in the ravine, she felt she might move forward, not on legs, but on will. Day by day, the little cabin began to echo with new sounds. The scrape of wood wheels across the floor as Saka practiced moving. The quiet clink of a tin cup when Wade set water near her. The steady rhythm of an axe striking wood outside the soft clatter of chickens near the porch. These small sounds wove into something like a life, something shared. At night, they often sat at opposite ends of the room, the oil lamp flickering in the center. Their silence was no longer empty. It carried meaning. Saka stitched torn cloth while Wade sharpened his knife. When their eyes met across the shadows, neither turned away. A nod, a glance, a moment of stillness, they were enough to soften the weight of loneliness that had haunted them both for years. One morning, Saka leaned against the doorway, breathing in the dry wind. Wade came back from the corral, a bundle of firewood over his shoulder. She watched him for a long moment before asking softly, "How long have you lived out here alone?" He paused, shifted his weight, and answered, "Since I lost my wife." His voice was as dry as dust, but his eyes revealed what words could not, a wound that time had never healed. Saka lowered her gaze to the rough wrappings at her thighs, touched the bandages gently, and whispered, "I lost my family." Her words fell heavy, yet in that small cabin they sounded like an opening door. From that moment they were no longer strangers. They were 2 broken souls beneath the same roof, and strangely that made the burden lighter. The next day, Wade shortened the legs of an old chair so she could sit upright more easily. For the first time, Saka cooked a pot of thin stew from the wild greens he had gathered. They sat across from each other and ate in silence, but it was the warmest meal either had tasted in years. No one spoke the words, "Thank you." Yet their presence at the table was thanks enough. That night, while desert winds rattled the shutters, Saka pulled the blanket to her chest and turned her head toward Wade, who had fallen asleep, slumped over the table. His figure looked weary in the glow of the lamp, but not defeated. An unexpected thought came to her. Perhaps she was not alone in the world anymore. Their wounds, terrible as they were, no longer felt unbearable when set side by side. In that small wooden house, 2 people abandoned by the world were learning to live again, not as the unbroken warriors they once had been, but as souls slowly rising from the ashes. In the weeks that followed, the little wooden house at Copper Ridge slowly became its own world. No longer just a shelter for a dying woman and a man who had lost everything, it began to carry the warmth of something like a home. And within that narrow space, something fragile started to take root. Each morning, Saka pulled herself out of bed, her arms growing stronger with every day of practice on the wooden chair Wade had built. At first, even a few pushes left her trembling sweat soaking through her thin shirt, but Wade was always there, standing close, one hand steady on the rail of her chair, ready to catch her if she faltered. He said nothing, but his patience told her what words could not. She was not alone in this fight. She was not pitied nor abandoned. She was seen as someone clawing her way back to life. Once, when she struggled to reach the table and dropped a wooden cup, her hands shaking too hard to hold it, Wade bent to pick it up. He did not sigh, did not scold. He only said, "Keep at it. Tomorrow you'll be steadier." The words were simple, but they bound her to life like a rope in the dark. That night, lying still beneath her blanket, Saka clenched the fabric in her fist and felt something rise in her chest. She still had worth. She still had hope. In the silence of the cabin, small gestures began to take on larger meaning. Wade often left one of his old shirts folded neatly at the foot of her bed for her to wear when her dress was torn beyond use. And Saka, when he came in from a long day of work, would quietly set a bowl of warm water on the table for him, a wordless greeting. They did not talk much, but care slipped into their habits. One afternoon, after forcing herself out onto the porch, Saka sat beneath the shade of the overhang, her eyes turned towards the pale sky scattered with clouds. Wade came out, his hand still stained with dirt from the corral. They sat side by side, saying nothing. The desert wind carried the dry scent of mesquite. Then Saka spoke, her voice low but firm. "I thought I would die in that ravine. But you lifted me up." Wade didn't answer right away. His rough hands tightened on his knees. Then at last he said, "I thought my life was over too, until I found you." They did not look at each other then, but the silence between them felt different. A bond had formed, invisible, yet undeniable. In the days that followed, their rhythm grew natural. Saka began trying to help with small tasks, washing a few bowls, sorting herbs, weaving frayed rope. She was clumsy at first, but Wade never stopped her. He let her learn, let her claim her place in the life they were building, and in return, he changed, too. His words grew longer than one-syllable replies. His silences felt less heavy, and Saka, instead of calling him Silent Man, began to speak his name, Wade, whenever she needed him. One evening after supper, they sat near the fire. Saka watched his rough hand splitting kindling and asked softly, "Do you ever get afraid?" Wade looked up, lamplight falling across the scar that cut from his jaw to his ear. Afraid of what? Of losing someone again? The question hung heavy. At last he answered, "The day I lost my wife, I swore I could never bear it twice. Truth is, I still fear it. Every day." The honesty in his voice, bare and unguarded, made something inside her ease. Because she knew that fear, too, it was not his alone. That night, while the desert wind moaned against the shutters, Saka lay on the cot, her hand pressed to the bone bead necklace her brother had given her. She knew she had not forgiven the past. But here in this cabin with this man, she felt something stir. Not just survival, but a longing to be wanted, to be seen, to live as a woman again, not merely as a warrior broken by war. Their closeness did not come from sweet words or promises. It came from the rough hands that dressed her wounds, from the patience of training, from glances held a heartbeat too long. In the silence of the desert, two hearts, once shattered, were beginning to find each other again. As spring deepened into the early heat of summer, the little wooden cabin became more than shelter. What had once been only a refuge for a dying woman and a grieving man now carried the warmth of something different, something alive. Within its walls, the quiet bond between Wade and Saka shifted into something deeper. Saka, after weeks of practice, had grown stronger on the wooden chair Wade had built. Her hands were calloused, her arms firm, moving the wheels with the stubborn will of a warrior. But the real change was not in her strength. It was in the way she began to feel seen. Not as broken, not as a cripple left behind, but as a woman standing in her own right beside a man. Each time Wade's steady hand caught her when she faltered, his eyes did not hold pity. They held respect and something gentler, unspoken. One evening, as the last light faded from the desert sky, Saka sat on the porch, the dry wind cooling the sweat on her brow. Wade sat beside her, his hat resting on his knee. They didn't speak for a long while. The horizon burned orange, then softened to purple. Finally, Saka turned, her voice low but steady. "You're not afraid. I'm only half a person." Wade looked at her, calm, his pale eyes unwavering. "You're whole," he said simply. That's what I see. The words struck her like sunlight breaking through clouds. For the first time in years, laughter slipped from her chest, rough, short, but real. Wade's mouth curved just faintly, but it was enough. In that fragile exchange, they crossed a line. They were no longer just two survivors under the same roof. They were two people, daring to hope again. That night, in the quiet of the cabin, Saka sat near the oil lamp as it flickered on the table. Wade entered dust on his shirt hair, untidy from the long day. He leaned the axe against the wall and lowered himself beside her cot. For a moment, they only looked at each other. Then slowly, Saka reached out, placing her hand on his. The touch was slight, but certain. Wade did not pull back. He wrapped his fingers around hers, and in that grip lay something neither had known for years, the feeling of being held. The distance between them built from loss, and scars dissolved in the hush of their breathing. For the first time, they allowed themselves to be more than the broken shells the world had left behind. Saka leaned her forehead against Wade's shoulder, feeling the heat of his body, and Wade, for the first time since the fire, folded his arms around another human being without fear. When their lips met, it was not hurried, not desperate. It was an affirmation. A vow made without words from now on. Neither would face the world alone. In Wade's arms, Saka was no longer the abandoned woman in the ravine. She was whole-wanted, loved. And in Saka's breath against his skin, Wade rediscovered the warmth of home, the pulse of family he thought had burned away forever. That night, they lay together on the narrow bed. The room was small, but closeness made it vast. The lamp's glow traced the scars on their bodies, yet neither saw brokenness. They saw only wholeness reflected in each other's eyes. When Saka touched the old scar along Wade's hip, she whispered, "We both carry ghosts." Wade nodded, pulling her closer. "But I don't fear them anymore. Not with you." They fell asleep in each other's arms. Breaths joined. For the first time in years, Wade did not dream of flames stealing his wife. For the first time since the ravine, Saka did not see the blood or her brother's desperate eyes. In sleep they found peace, something both had believed was gone forever. And when morning light spilled through the cabin window, Saka opened her eyes to the man beside her. She knew then they were no longer just survivors. They had found one another, and with that, they had found love that gave them back their worth. Their days of peace did not last. As summer crept closer, dry winds carried rumors through the saloons and dusty streets of nearby towns. Somewhere beyond Copper Ridge, an Apache woman had survived the massacre. The tale was vague, but it burned bright in the eyes of bounty hunters hungry for coin and reputation. To them, a crippled woman was not a human being, but a prize to be dragged in for a handful of dollars. And to the federal soldiers, she was little more than an escaped prisoner who needed to be dragged back into chains. Wade sensed the danger before Saka ever heard it. One morning he returned from Copper Ridge with sacks of flour slung across his saddle, but his eyes were darker than usual. He said nothing at first, yet Saka knew. His hands clenched the reins too tightly, not with weariness, but with worry. "What is it?" She pressed her sharp eyes, cutting into him. Wade set the flour on the table, stood silent for a beat, then muttered, "They're asking questions. Said they saw tracks out east. They think someone survived." The cabin felt smaller at once, the air heavy as stone. For a moment, Saka was back in the ravine, seeing her brother's eyes as he left her behind. Would it happen again? Would she be abandoned once more? But Wade's voice cut through her fear. His gaze was hard as iron. "They won't have you," he said flatly. "Not ever." That night he rolled back a faded rug and pried open a hidden hatch in the floor. Beneath lay a narrow dugout he had carved long ago after losing his wife, a place where he once hid his grief, his rifles, and a few barrels of food and water. He had never shown it to another soul. Now it became her refuge. Saka stared down into the dark hole, her breath quick and shallow. The thought of being buried alive in that silence made her chest clench. But Wade's eyes anchored her. "If they come," he said, voice steady as a vow, You go down here. I'll stand on the ground above. Any man crosses this door uninvited, I shoot." His certainty made her throat tighten. She clutched his hand. "And if you die," Wade didn't blink. "I won't. I've lost enough. I'm not losing you too." The days that followed were thick with unease. Every echo of hooves on the horizon set them on edge. Saka kept a knife hidden beneath her blanket, her fingers gripping the handle until calluses formed. Wade cleaned his rifle each night, counting his cartridges twice over. He prowled the porch after dark eyes sweeping the hills like a wolf guarding its den. Then the day they feared arrived. Late one sweltering afternoon, dust rose on the road. 2 riders in federal coats reined in at the fence. One read a command aloud, his voice cutting through the heat. "We seek an Apache woman name Saka recorded in military reports as having fought against United States forces. She yet lives. By order of the marshal, she is to be taken and returned." Inside the cabin, Saka sat frozen, her heart thundering like war drums. The trapdoor stood open, the earth beneath breathing damp air. Wade planted himself in the doorway, rifle lowered, but ready. "No one here," he said, voice like cold steel. Suspicious eyes swept across the cabin, tracing every crack in the boards, every shadow along the porch. One rider demanded to search. Wade blocked the way, his hand easy but firm on the rifle's stock. "You got a warrant?" he asked. The soldier shoved forward a stamped paper, but Wade barely glanced at it before growling, "That's no warrant, and this house ain't open to soldiers." The silence stretched taut as a drawn bowstring. Below the floor, Saka held her breath knife clutched tight, ready to strike if the hatch lifted. Above, Wade's eyes did not waver. He looked like a man who had already lost everything and had nothing left to fear. At last, the riders spat their curses, muttering threats as they turned their horses and vanished into a haze of dust. Only when the echo of hooves had faded did Wade lift the hatch. Saka crawled up, sweat dripping down her temples, her breath ragged. She did not cry, but her eyes gleamed with something fierce terror and resolve intertwined. "They'll be back," she whispered. Wade nodded, resting a firm hand on her shoulder. "Then we'll be ready." That night, the cabin was quieter than ever, but in the silence they both understood the world would not forgive them. Their fragile love had already drawn the eyes of enemies, and if they wanted to keep it, they would have to fight not only with bullets, but with the unshakable promise that this time, neither of them would ever leave the other behind. After the encounter with the Federal riders, the cabin at Copper Ridge no longer felt like a sanctuary. The air inside pressed heavy, like the ground before a storm. Wade slept less, his gaze constantly fixed on the window, listening for every sound that drifted from the hills. Yet it was Saka who broke the silence first. One evening, as they sat by the fire in the small kitchen, she placed her hand flat on the table, her voice calm but unwavering. "I won't run." Wade's head lifted, his eyes flashing with a mixture of anger and fear. "Saka, you know, if they return in greater numbers, then we face them." She cut in, her dark eyes burning. "I've been running my whole life, from soldiers, from death, from memories I couldn't carry. But not this time. I choose to stay. I choose you." For a long moment, Wade only stared at her in the flicker of firelight. What he saw was not a crippled woman, not a refugee. She was a warrior, a partner. Her words were no rash declaration. They were a vow. At last, he exhaled, his rough hand tightening around the rifle beside his chair. "If that's your choice, then I won't stand against it. From the moment I carried you out of that ravine, I knew my life was no longer my own." A smile touched Saka's lips, faint yet powerful. "Then from this day, we are one, in life or death." From that night on, they prepared. Wade rebuilt the fence around the cabin, drove sharpened stakes into the ground, and reset iron traps on the paths that led to the ridge. He checked every rifle, polished the steel until it gleamed in the lamplight. Saka, for her part, spent her days braiding rope, sharpening knives, and teaching Wade a handful of Apache signals they could use without words. Even seated in her wooden chair, she radiated the bearing of a commander. The scars on her body had never touched the fire of her spirit. One morning, returning from the creek, Wade stopped short at the sight of her. Saka had rolled her chair out onto the porch, a weathered bough in her hands. Drawing back the string, she loosed an arrow that thudded deep into the post across the yard. Wade stood frozen eyes, bright with surprise. "Since when have you been practicing?" She smirked. "Since the nights you thought I was asleep." Handing him the bow, she added, "I am not a burden. Treat me as your equal." Wade stepped closer, placing a calloused hand on her shoulder. "Not my equal, Saka. My wife." Those words my wife struck her like the binding of two souls. She said nothing, only leaned her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart. In that sound, she knew even if the world turned against them, they would not be divided. The days that followed unfolded like the eve of battle. Meals were simple, taken quickly. Every creek in the woods was met with alert eyes, but woven into the tension were moments of tenderness that bound them tighter still. Wade often sat beside her while she practiced with the bow, sometimes correcting the tilt of her wrist. And Saka, when he returned exhausted from his labor, placed a bowl of warm water in his hands, her eyes saying what her lips did not: "You are not alone." One night, as the firelight glowed across their faces, Saka whispered, "If they come tomorrow, will you regret this?" Wade's gaze met hers clear and firm as stone. "No. I've lived too long in the dark. If the price of light is fighting for it, then I'll pay it." Saka gripped his hand, and he folded his over hers, strong and unyielding. "Then we fight together," she said. In that moment, the weight of fear dissolved into something greater. They were no longer two wounded souls clinging to one another for comfort. They were halves of a single vow, an oath to stand side by side until the very end. After weeks of living with their nerves strung tight when every distant hoofbeat could have meant death, silence finally returned to Copper Ridge. But it was not the silence of fear this time. It was the quiet of peace. For the first time in months, Saka awoke without hearing gunfire in her dreams, without jerking upright at the sound of wind brushing against the cabin door. Morning sunlight spilled through the small window, golden and gentle, as though even the Arizona desert had decided to soften for a moment and grant them rest. Wade still rose early, as always, his horse tethered near the barn, his rifle hanging in its usual place. But there was a new ease in his face. Sitting on the porch, he sipped a tin cup of black coffee. When Saka wheeled herself out onto the porch to join him, he smiled an unguarded smile, no shadow behind it. "It's a fine day," she said quietly. The wind carried the scent of dry grass horses and rain-soaked earth, a mixture any Westerner would know by heart. Wade glanced at her eyes, warm. "It is. But it's finer because you're here." From that day, they stopped dancing around what they already knew. For Wade, Saka was not just the woman he had rescued, not just a companion. She was his wife. And for Saka, in choosing not to flee and standing with him against danger, she had claimed Wade as her husband. In 19th century America, out on the frontier, those words, husband and wife, carried a weight heavier than law. They were a covenant of the heart, as binding as steel. Together, they began to build their life anew. Wade repaired the fences, hammering each post deep into the ground, as though staking his claim not just to land, but to a future. He called it their homestead, humble though it was. Saka tended a small patch of corn, planting seeds with patient care, as though each seed held the promise of a tomorrow. In the evenings, when the long light of the prairie stretched across the valley, they shared simple meals, cornbread, salted meat, a bit of fresh milk. There were no grand feasts, but there was fullness all the same. What struck them most was the silence. Not the tense silence of dread, but the quiet contentment of two souls at ease. Wade sat reading his worn Bible while Saka mended his shirt. The cabin glowed not with candlelight, but with the warmth of belonging. The people of Copper Ridge began to notice. They saw the grizzled Confederate veteran and the Apache woman in her wooden chair, side by side, working and smiling. At first there was suspicion, even disdain. But as time passed, folks saw the way Wade never left her side, and the way Saka carried herself with dignity, never bowing to pity. Out here in the West, where survival depended on grit and loyalty, people learned to respect them. In American frontier culture, a home was never just walls and roof. It was the place where a man or woman found meaning to keep going. For Wade, after years of loss, he had found that meaning again. For Saka, after being left to die in the ravine, she had discovered what she thought she would never know: a true home, where she was not a crippled survivor, but a wife cherished and whole. One afternoon, as the desert winds carried heat across the valley, Saka clasped Wade's hand. "If someday we have a child," she asked softly, "what will you tell them?" Wade looked out over the field, golden in the late sun. Then he spoke slow and steady. "I'll tell them their mother was the bravest soul I ever knew, that we chose each other, and we held on even when the world wanted us apart." Her eyes filled with tears. For the first time, Saka let herself dream of tomorrow, not just surviving, but living. To those of you hearing this story, perhaps you see now, Wade and Saka are more than characters of the Old West. They are the embodiment of humanity's greatest desire: to love, to be respected, and to build a home, even after loss. In a world that tried to take everything from them, they dared to believe in one another, and they turned despair into hope. And so the question falls to us, the listeners: will we stand behind them? Will we root for them as they shape their new life together, defying prejudice, defying the past? Their love is not a private tale. It is a mirror of the human spirit and the power of steadfast choice. Perhaps their next step will be to grow this homestead, to build a larger house to raise cattle, or to welcome a child into their lives carrying their legacy forward. Whatever form it takes, what matters most is that they remain true to their vow. We are one. In life or death, it is a reminder for all of us. Sometimes home is not where you were born, but where you choose to stay side by side with the one who holds your heart. And in the American soul, that word home has always been the most sacred promise of all.